560 The Answer online at 560theanswer.com, on the AM 560 mobile app, on your Alexa-powered smart speaker, and on TuneIn, iHeart, and on Odyssey. Now, from the Signature Bank Studios, this is Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan Proft and Amy Jacobson. If you're looking for the latest news, insight into what it means, and the sharpest opinion, there's only one station in Chicago where you can turn, and it's this one. We're AM 560, The Answer.
Top of the morning, Dan, and in for Amy J. This morning is Charles Thomas, former ABC 7 political reporter.
Yeah, this is the bell lap for the day.
It is. It is. We're coming in for a hard finish. Interesting exchange the other day on MSNBC. I watch it so you don't have to.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Stuart Stevens, who touts himself as a Republican. He's worked on 5 presidential campaigns. He was the senior advisor to the Mitt Romney 2012 presidential campaign.
We know how that turned out.
Not well. And he now is a part of the Lincoln Project since they moved the child predator out, the Never Trump Lincoln Project. Never. It should be. I think it should be expanded. It's the Never GOP. Never Conservative is the misnamed Lincoln Project. But there's something important about Stuart Stevens here. One is very current, and the other is reflective on the last 20 years or so, maybe going back to, frankly, Reagan. The current is Stuart Stevens is not worried about Trump. He's worried about DeSantis. DeSantis is worse. For those who thought that get Trump out of the way, DeSantis is a safe bet because they can't come at him like they come at Trump. Really? This is somebody who identifies as a Republican political consultant.
What'll happen here?
And Stuart, I'm going to give you the last word on this because, Chris Christie got booed for telling the truth about Trump. And he's at 5%. He's somewhere. He's not nowhere. He's ahead of Nikki Haley and some of the others. But what does it say about the Republican Party that the next guy down is Ron DeSantis, who is running the most openly fascist campaign I think I've ever seen? And I'm saying that having covered Donald Trump running for president. That's the next guy down.
Yeah, I suppose if you're inside the DeSantis war room, you've got to think of a way to get yourself indicted to get up ahead of Donald Trump. This just goes to my point that this is what the party wants to be. And it's a hard thing for a lot of us who worked in the party to accept that we helped create this model. But we did. And this is very purposeful by the party. It's not something they stumbled into. Their second choice is a guy who is worse than Trump. So it's a threat to what it means really to be an American. And I think we have to realize that and address it accordingly.
The guy yucking it up with Joy Reid saying DeSantis is worse than Trump. He's a threat to what it means to be an American. Fascism is thrown around liberally on that show, like mostly in most quarters within the D.C. press corps. And the guy they're calling a fascist, Ron DeSantis, Stuart Stevens was kibitzing with Joy Reid. Ron DeSantis was over talking to Shannon Bream on Fox, saying this about the swamp and what he aims to do.
But what's happened in Washington, this has been an accumulation of power over decades. These are people who issue edicts. None of us elect these people. What kind of car you can drive, what kind of energy you can use. We need to fundamentally reconstitutionalize the government. We talked about draining the swamp in 2016. That didn't happen. I think the better analogy is breaking the swamp, because you can drain it a little bit, and the next guy can fill it back in. So we're going to fundamentally reshape Washington. We're going to bring major accountability to the DOJ, to the FBI, IRS. That requires a president that's disciplined, that's determined, and that's not going to get distracted and take their eye off the ball.
The idea that Ron DeSantis, who then went on to talk about the agencies he would eliminate if he could get congressional support to do so, including the IRS, that has now a 5-year record as the governor of Florida in which the state is an economic dynamo and also has one of the lowest state employees per capita count in the country while having no income tax. while having a property tax that is effectively capped a fraction of what you pay in these sophisticated urban centers like Chicago and New York. And that's fascism to Stuart Stevens and Joy Reid, particularly Stuart Stevens, because the larger point I wanted to make about him is the enemies inside the perimeter in the Republican Party that do the bidding of the left, that do what the left can't do, which is destroy it from within. And in Illinois, we know that all too well. Those who are interested in the spoils of war politics, those that are interested in bipartisanship for the purpose of advancing big government so they get payouts, which is what we've seen in Illinois for the past 50 years, and which is why we have no opposition party. So if you think the Illinois Republican Party is a good model to scale nationally, then listen to Stuart Stevens. If you think what's going on in Florida is a good model to scale nationally, then listen to DeSantis and, to some extent, Trump and other Republicans as well.
America needs an off-ramp, Dan. They need an off-ramp, man. From the division of the last, really, 12 years, man. I mean,
well, we'll get Arthur Milikh to adjudicate this, because you can't get an off-ramp when the left is driving the car. They don't want to get off the ramp. You need to force them off. So what does that look like?
Well, if there's a ramp there, I think maybe independents can force them off.
Maybe. Arthur Milikh is the executive director for the Calremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life, that is. Editor of the just-released book, Up From Conservatism, Revitalizing the Right After a Generation of Decay. And this is very interesting because it's got it's essentially a compendium of commentaries from a lot of really interesting thinkers you've heard on this show. You certainly heard me reference the Michael Antons and Richard Hananias and Aaron Renz and Eric Kaufman from Birkbeck College of London, Roger Kimball from New Criterion. So it's definitely worth a pickup. Arthur Milikh, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
What about, I know this is a philosophical treatise or treatises in part, but what about what Stuart Stevens said about Ron DeSantis and what that tells us about, certain elements that consider themselves part of the center right or part of, as he said, preserving what it means to be an American?
Right. No, it's a very important dynamic that exists only on the right, if you notice, and not on the left. Namely, that on the right, we always have people that claim to be on the right whose sole job is to tap the brakes on what the right would like to do. And a very interesting part of this is that during that clip you played, he said, well, it's regrettable that the party has made this decision, the party. The problem is it's not the party, it's the voters. It's the voters who have growing contempt for their own party, which is what explains the Trump revolution, which is what explains DeSantis's rise. And it's growing contempt of the voter base for what is taking place in America, how America is becoming more and more lawless, how America is becoming lopsided rule, how America is starting more and more from Washington to look like Chicago, San Francisco, New York City. And the right has learned that you can vote your heart out year after year, election after election, generation after generation, and never get anything you want on the core issues that affect your life. And I don't mean just the economic issues. I mean also on immigration, for example. We vote all the time to end illegal immigration, and it gets worse and worse and worse. And the left's adopted rhetoric, which is not new, but it's bubbled up more and more lately, is that anything that you say to try and stop what we're doing is fascism. That is fascism. And the right is going to have to learn to walk through these kinds of accusations. And importantly, the only way to do that is to build up genuine power on your side so that you can walk through those accusations, institutional power and state power.
And so before we get to what that looks like in addition to winning elections and making appointments, you sort of reference in the preface to the commentaries contained in the book about the right's failure to understand the nature of the left. Describe that failure in your view, as well as the failure to describe, to understand some of the enemies inside the perimeter before they organize into the Lincoln Project, I would add.
Right. Well, I think that the fundamental errors that the right has made have been ideological, namely that we wanted to believe on the right for the last generation or two that politics is really about the economy. If you can grow the economy, and you should do anything necessary to grow the economy, on those grounds, you can have a normal, safe, and stable country. And that is just not true. You can actually combine growing tyranny with a free-ish market. So it was partly our ideology. It was also partly that the right underestimated how imperious and insidious the left is, how it's not a live and let live ideology, how it expands from institution to institution, from schools to schools. I mean, it's kind of amazing that you go to rural America and you see all of the textbooks there are more or less leftist, right underneath the noses of red people. And it's because of this morally imperious feature of the left that the right didn't want to accept was true. The right always wanted to compromise, thinking the left would tap the brakes after that compromise happened. But it was simply never the case. Look at what happened just a couple of years ago. Just the moment when they win a huge, generational victory on gay marriage in the Supreme Court, the next day they turned to transgenderism. This caught the right off guard, and it shouldn't have. And so a new right has to be aware that this will never end unless the right does something to put a stop to it.
And give us an example. I mean, Richard Hanania has an essay in there about some of the things the right should be doing to confront the left and the institutions that are foundational for a free and civil society. But some examples of what center-right folks, conservatives, should be thinking about when it comes to reclaiming institutions that have been lost.
Yeah. So, look, let me give you the example that is the lowest hanging fruit. It's one we've been talking about as conservatives for a very long time and have always failed to do it because we have never had the right spirit and the right attitude about it. So we've always been laughing about universities, how they're getting worse and worse. So first we laughed, and now we're scared. The question is, what do you do with those institutions? So our view is you break them. There are a handful of them that should be pushed into insolvency because we have way too many universities in this country, an absurd amount. And in other places, you take them over. And you take them over in a way that DeSantis has shown is possible in Florida, and you reform them and you turn them into your own, just like the left has done in the past with almost every other university and college. So it's not about, let's get one conservative on the faculty and that'll create a counterbalance. It's not about, let's ensure that there's free speech on campus. Those things don't matter if the institution itself is overwhelmingly on the left. And so the attitude has to be one of conquest, reform, recreation in the image of institutions that are actually useful to the country.
Professor, don't we have to stop the left before we can really move the country even back to the center? We have to stop them first. I'm speaking of presidential politics here.
Well, look, it's a fair point, but I would just ask, what would it mean to stop them without institutional power?
Well, but get them out of office, basically. Out of the executive branch.
Right. I understand. My view is a little more pessimistic than that statement. And the reason is we learned a great deal from 2016 to 2020. That, in fact, what we saw is that there isn't a presidency per se in a way that we wanted to believe there was. The right has liked to engage heavily on electoral politics and not heavily on institution building, on the belief that, once we get into office, we do what we can do and we do what our voters say to get our policies into place. And the truth is that does not work. And that does not work because the left more or less controls the federal government apparatus to the extent that, again, look at what they did to Trump. They They can stymie, they can slow roll, they can leak, they can humiliate, they can outright refuse legal orders from a president, and nobody ever gets punished. So capturing the presidency is one essential part, but we cannot put all of our eggs into that basket. It will not work.
He is Arthur Milikh, Executive Director of the Calremont Institute Center for the American Way of Life, editor of the just-released book Up From Conservatism, Revitalizing the Right After a Generation of Decay, which includes a lot of great commentaries from great thinkers like David Azerrod, our friend at Hillsdale, Joshua Mitchell, our friend from Georgetown, many others. So do pick that up. Up From Conservatism, edited by Arthur Milikh from the Calremont Institute. Arthur Milikh, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
And he joins us on the Turnkey.Pro answer line.
It's what Chicago is talking about. It's Chicago's Morning Answer with Dan and Amy on AM 560. The Answer.
Signature Bank is Chicago's fastest growing independently owned business bank. It's a bank where relationships still matter. Signature Bank knows your name,